Ever wonder how the wealthiest Americans lived in every decade, from our country's founding all the way up to right now? Hi everyone, Ken here. In today's episode, we're going to explore that very question in detail. Hit that subscribe button and let's dive into a special episode of This House. This video is brought to you in part by Victorian society in America. More on them later. Picture the late 1700s. The ink of the Declaration of Independence has barely dried, and most people are living in small wood frame houses or log cabins. But not these folks. Instead, the wealthiest families might own expansive plantations or stately brick homes styled in the Georgian or early federal fashion. Back then, it was all about how many acres of land you possessed. Land was basically the currency of status. If you were wealthy, your home likely included multiple rooms, a proper parlor for social gatherings, and maybe even a hallway large enough to impress guests. There could be 8, 10, or even more fireplaces throughout the house, each one essential for heating, often with detached kitchens where servants, paid or unpaid, would prepare your family's every meal. You can imagine average folks stepping inside and immediately realizing they were in a world quite different from the typical small cabin or tenement that everyone else was used to. Even so, if you were among the top tier, life was still rough by our modern standards. There were no flushing toilets or electric lights, just chamber pots, candles, and oil lamps. Diseases and infections would strike without warning, driving the wealthiest families to rely on whatever expensive remedies were around, including having physicians make house calls, physicians who still relied on questionable treatments like bloodletting. If you reached your 50s or 60s back then, that was considered a pretty decent lifespan, even in the wealthiest circles. You might find imported tea, fine sugar, and fancy china in their cupboards, tiny luxuries that set them apart from everyone else. But the day-to-day was still lit by flickering flame and set at a pace based on how fast a horse could trot. Fast forward a bit to the early 1800s and you'll see the wealthiest Americans in the budding United States living in homes that start to reflect fresh architectural styles like the graceful lines of Federal or Greek Revival design. Maybe you'd find them in Charleston, South Carolina, hosting lavish garden parties on a well-manicured estate, or in Boston's expanding neighborhoods, commissioning brick row houses with refined interiors. While most Americans still squeezed large families into cramped cabins, the upper crust was often busy creating separate bedrooms and formal dining rooms, installing early versions of cast iron stoves, and showing off fancy tableware and wallpaper imported from Europe. These glimpses of grandeur might not blow us away today, but if you were a middle or lower class neighbor dropping by, you'd be in awe of the polished floors, the expensive drapes, and the fact they might even have a small army of servants to handle all the cooking and cleaning. By the 1820s and 1830s, as the nation expanded, those at the top enjoyed the fruits of emerging infrastructure. The wealthiest Southerners built grand Greek Revival plantation homes with monumental columns arranged in porticos and lining their verandas. Northern elites in places like New York and Philadelphia took advantage of new trade opportunities, shipping in coffee, spices, and other goods from around the globe, delicacies you wouldn't find at your typical farm. Land and opportunity continued to serve as key indicators of wealth, although an industrializing economy meant that a few savvy merchants or manufacturers could challenge the old guard of plantation owners by capitalizing on new industry. The difference was easy to see in their homes, from carved marble mantels to elaborate moldings. Each detail served to remind any visitor that they were in the presence of someone who had power, status, and money. Roll into the mid-1800s and you can practically hear the hum of factories in the north and the steady beat of cotton production in the south. But for the wealthy, life often revolved around refined social gatherings, complete with multi-course dinners served in candlelit dining rooms decked out with the latest wallpapers. They welcomed guests with oysters, imported cheeses, and brandy, even while most Americans got by on salted pork and seasonal vegetables. Gaslighting started to appear in some urban mansions by the 1840s, illuminating rooms in a way that must have dazzled onlookers who were used to the dim glow of candles. When the Civil War erupted in the 1860s, everything changed. Some well-heeled families in the South saw their fortunes demolished, and if their estates survived, they often had to rebuild in a drastically altered economy. Meanwhile, northern industrialists who had invested in railroads, steel, or manufacturing found opportunities to expand their empires. It might seem odd to talk about fortunes growing during wartime, but that's exactly what happened for a select few. If you were in that top tier, your home might include early plumbing, private rooms for every family member, dedicated dressing rooms, and perhaps the newest thing called central heating. Imagine that, instead of having your staff chopping wood for dozens of fireplaces, you might have a coal-fired boiler in the basement and a network of ducts pushing warm air into different parts of the house, freeing up staff for more luxurious jobs. Then comes the period Mark Twain famously dubbed the Gilded Age, roughly from the 1870s through the 1890s. This is when wealth went from comfortable to outright outrageous. Think of those colossal mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York, the cottages in Newport, Rhode Island that were effectively small European palaces, or the lavish summer estates dotting the Hudson River. These industrial titans, people like John D. Rockefeller or Cornelius Vanderbilt, weren't content to merely build a home that impressed the neighbors. They built estates that practically screamed, "I have more money than entire countries." Marble staircases, gold-plated chandeliers, imported European art, and enormous ballrooms that could host hundreds of guests all became the norm for the upper echelons. They threw parties that lasted till dawn with endless courses of French cuisine, and they had staff to handle every imaginable task, from turning down the beds at night to ensuring that fresh flowers adorned each room daily and guaranteed the family of the house never had to lift a finger for anything. Ordinary Americans reading about these affairs in the newspaper might never have seen electric lighting, but by the 1880s, these mansions were being outfitted with the newest technology Edison or Tesla could dream up. Approaching the turn of the 20th century, life expectancy for the wealthiest inched higher thanks to better nutrition and improved medical knowledge. Though not everyone fully trusted doctors, after all, medical science was still figuring out germs and surgeries. The huge influx of immigrant labor in the late 1800s and early 1900s also meant that domestic staff became more available. A grand home for one of the wealthiest families could easily employ hundreds of staff, including a butler, several maids, cooks, gardeners, and maybe a nanny or governess for the children. If you visited one of these places, you'd be struck by the scale: multiple floors, separate wings for entertaining and for family life, grand libraries filled with leather-bound books, and brand new conveniences like telephones or private bathrooms with hot and cold running water. When the 1900s arrived, you might even see more extravagance, but also a little pushback. Progressive era movements tried to tackle corruption and curb monopolies. Still, wealth continued to pile up for some. Homes got fancy new touches like central electricity, advanced heating systems, and complicated decor often inspired by European palaces. Think Beaux-Arts or neoclassical city mansions. Meanwhile, the invention of automobiles made it possible for a wealthy family to own a personal car, a sight that definitely turned heads wherever they went. It was a time when those at the top could harness not just labor of thousands in their factories, but also the latest gadgets in their personal residences. Even so, the 1910s ended up overshadowed by World War I, prompting these families to tone down more ostentatious parties in favor of supporting war bonds and occasionally volunteering their parlors for patriotic causes, particularly for fundraising efforts to support the most fashionable charity of the time, the Red Cross. Then the 1920s strutted in, roaring 20s, jazz, flappers, speakeasies, and an unstoppable stock market, until 1929 that is. For most of the decade, the wealthiest Americans reveled in Art Deco penthouses, fancy suburban mansions, and day-long parties fueled by imported liquor, despite prohibition. Ladies of the house might wear the latest designs from Paris, and the men hopped into sleek new automobiles or even private yachts to entertain friends along the coastline. Cocktail parties became a social staple, letting the wealthy show off their brand new radios and electric refrigerators to astound guests. You can picture them turning into jazz stations while mixing gin fizzies in their meticulously decorated living rooms. But of course, by the decade's close, the stock market crashed, setting off the Great Depression and sending even some of the highest rollers into sudden ruin. Though plenty of old money families managed to keep their heads above water, holed up in their well-appointed homes with at least a skeleton crew of servants and some carefully managed investments. Before we head into the 1930s, a quick word about the sponsor of today's video, Victorian Society in America. Are you captivated by historic architecture? Want to explore, learn, and dive even deeper into the past? With the Victorian Society in America, you'll have the chance to travel to American cities and tour stunning 19th century buildings, pursue learning through internationally acclaimed summer programs in American cities and abroad, including Chicago, Newport, and London to name a few. Additionally, members will enjoy a free subscription to 19th Century, the semi-annual publication packed with articles on art, architecture, preservation awards, and book reviews. Visit the website below in the video description and become part of the Victorian Society in America today. Thank you, Victorian Society in America, for sponsoring today's video. Now back to our journey through time. The 1930s were a humbling time in many ways, but World War II came along and shifted the economy yet again. For those who had resources, there were plenty of wartime contracts and growth industries, meaning it was possible to get richer by producing weapons, vehicles, or steel. Still, people tended to keep extravagant parties behind closed doors. Nobody wanted to seem unpatriotic while sons, brothers, and fathers were off fighting. After the war in the late 1940s and certainly through the 1950s, a consumerist boom took hold. We think of this time as the birth of the broad middle class, when average families moved to suburbs and could afford to live in a single-family house, leaving the crowded cities behind. Yet at the top, bigger suburban estates with multiple cars, newly designed open-concept kitchens, and televisions in multiple rooms showcase the next level of living. Central air conditioning became a big deal, letting the wealthy lounge indoors in total comfort despite any summer heat wave. Cruise on into the 1960s and 1970s, and you'll see the wealthy embracing a wide range of lifestyles. Some remain traditional, grand, older mansions with ornate rooms and formal dining. Others went hyper-modern, constructing sleek, angular homes with massive windows to let in light, or even custom-built designer homes by famed architects. The post-war economy may have created more comfortable lives for many Americans, but the ultra-rich still maintained their advantage with second and even third homes in scenic spots, private jets, or at least first-class travel, and the best medical care money could buy. By now, life expectancy among this group was pushing up thanks to advanced antibiotics, hospital technology, and specialized doctors who catered to their every need. As the 1980s and 1990s rolled around, we saw the rise of yuppies, young urban professionals raking in money from finance, corporate takeovers, and later, tech ventures. Suburban mansions got bigger, with garages big enough for a car in every color, massive kitchens, and entire rooms devoted to home entertainment. Some families installed the earliest form of home computers, commodities that cost a small fortune at the time, as well as massive VHS collections to watch on big, wood-panel TV sets. Cell phones were huge and clunky at first, but owning one was a major status symbol, as was driving a European luxury car or wearing the latest designer suits. By the mid to late 90s, the internet was turning the gears of the tech boom, minting new millionaires and billionaires overnight in places like Silicon Valley. Suddenly, you didn't need to be from old money or own a factory. If you coded the right software, built the right startup, or invested early in the right IPO, you could join the ranks of the wealthy. Then came a new millennium and a housing bubble. The early 2000s saw some of the wealthiest folks snapping up massive homes, sometimes referred to as McMansions. But the super rich didn't stop at that. They installed top-of-the-line home theaters, gyms, and fully stocked wine cellars. If you were rich in the 2000s, your family most likely had a main house, a beach house, a lake house, maybe a mountain retreat, and a pied-à-terre in town. Even the 2008 financial crisis, which caused widespread chaos, was navigated by the ultra-wealthy with less disruption than what most families faced, with a good handful seeing record income. By the 2010s, smartphones, social media, and online everything took over. Tech moguls skyrocketed to billion-dollar fortunes in record time. The wealthy built or bought smart homes, properties with sophisticated security systems, automated lighting, voice-activated thermostats, and fridges that could practically do your grocery shopping for you. And that brings us to the present day, where you might see a billionaire constructing a mega mansion with 20 bedrooms, an infinity pool perched on a cliff, and an underground garage filled with electric supercars. Or perhaps they opt for a lavish penthouse in a futuristic skyscraper that has its own private elevator to whisk them directly inside. With modern medicine, top-quality foods, personal chefs, and personal trainers, these individuals can easily push life expectancy into the 80s and beyond. Some have speculated that we're now entering a second Gilded Age, pointing to how the wealth gap has widened dramatically, and the lifestyles of the richest Americans can look like something from a different planet compared to the average household. Personally, I can't help but marvel at how we went from candlelit estates in the 1700s, where even the wealthiest had to rely on horse-drawn travel, to fully automated mega mansions where a single voice command can change the lighting, start dinner, and fire up a movie in the home theater, all while your electric vehicle charges in the subterranean garage. It's been quite a journey, and it raises a lot of questions about how wealth shapes our society and our future. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Which era's elite lifestyle intrigues you the most? Are you dazzled by the grand ballrooms of the first Gilded Age, or would you prefer the sleek gadgets and ultramodern lifestyles of the wealthy today? Let me know down below in the comments section. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Victorian Society in America for sponsoring this video. Head over to their website, which is linked down below in the video description, and find out how you can become a member today. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time on This House.